Cameron Price sat alone at table 12 in the hospital cafeteria at 2:15 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon that had already lasted approximately 17 lifetimes, drinking tea that had gone lukewarm 20 minutes ago while he avoided returning to his daughter Zara's hospital room on the pediatric floor where she was recovering from emergency appendectomy that had happened at 6 a.m. after she'd woken screaming in pain that he couldn't fix no matter how hard he tried, trying to compose himself after watching his 7-year-old scream during the ambulance ride and grip his hand during pre-op and look at him with eyes that expected him to protect her from everything including the terrible pain radiating from her small body, feeling helpless as a single father who'd promised her dead mother India that he'd protect their daughter always, who'd sworn to his wife as she lay dying from cancer 2 years ago that Zara would never feel alone or scared or unprotected as long as he was breathing. 3 identical little girls with matching braids and identical worried faces approached his table with the kind of careful synchronization that only siblings who'd spent their entire lives together could achieve, and whispered with the desperate urgency usually reserved for life or death situations, "Excuse us, mister, we need you to pretend you're our father just for today, just until our mama's surgery is done, just so she doesn't have to be scared alone." He thought this was a strange request from children he'd never met, 3 6-year-olds who should have been supervised by actual adults rather than approaching strange men in hospital cafeterias with propositions about pretending to be family. Thought he should politely decline and return to his own daughter who was probably awake by now and wondering where her daddy had gone. Thought his hands were already too full with single fatherhood and grief and the weight of promises made to dying wives and the terror of watching his only child suffer to take on pretending for strangers who had their own crises that weren't his responsibility. But it wasn't a strange request he could decline with polite excuses about having his own problems, wasn't something he could dismiss as not his business or not his concern or someone else's responsibility because there was clearly no one else available to be responsible. It wasn't a situation where he could walk away from 3 desperate children who were looking at him with the same fear he'd seen in Zara's eyes just hours ago, the fear of children who understood that bad things could happen to the people they loved and that sometimes adults couldn't fix everything no matter how much power children believed adults possessed. It wasn't about pretending at all, he would realize later, wasn't about performing a role or playing a part but about being exactly what these girls needed, which was presence, stability, someone who would stay. Because these 3 girls, who introduced themselves in careful succession as Maya and Sophie and Emma like they'd practiced the introduction many times, needed someone to sit in the surgery waiting room with them while their single mother Rachel underwent emergency gallbladder surgery with no family nearby to support her. No grandmother or aunt or cousin or friend who could drop everything and rush to the hospital to hold 3 scared children's hands while their mother was cut open and stitched back together. They needed someone to hold their hands when they were scared, when the waiting stretched too long and the what-ifs became too loud and the fear that maybe mama wouldn't wake up became too overwhelming for 6-year-olds to carry alone. They needed a father figure for just a few hours because their own father had abandoned them years ago, had walked away when they were babies, and the reality of raising triplets had proved too overwhelming for someone who'd never wanted the responsibility in the first place. Had left their mother to figure out single parenthood times 3 without child support or co-parenting or any acknowledgement that he'd created 3 humans who would grow up wondering why daddy didn't love them enough to stay. And when Cameron saw the fear in their eyes, saw the way they held hands like a chain that kept them anchored to each other when everything else felt unstable, saw the careful way they approached him like they'd been rejected before and were bracing for rejection again, he remembered being 7 years old and scared in a hospital just like Zara had been this morning. Remembered his own mother holding his hand during his appendectomy when he was 8 and how her presence had been the only thing that made the fear bearable. What he did next would teach him that sometimes healing your own broken heart means helping heal someone else's, that grief carried alone becomes unbearable but grief shared with others who understand becomes survivable, that being a father to one child prepares you to be kind to all children because fatherhood at its core is about showing up even when showing up is hard, that the worst days of your life can become the beginning of the best things if you're brave enough to say yes when children ask for help. If you believe that showing up for strangers in their darkest moments is how we heal our own darkness, that kindness costs nothing but means everything, especially in hospitals where everyone is scared and vulnerable and desperate for connection. That compassion toward children who need help is never wasted, even when you're drowning in your own crisis. Please like this video right now. Share it with someone who needs to remember that humanity still exists in small acts of courage, and comment below where you're watching from, because every like and share helps spread stories about compassion to people who've forgotten that we're all just trying to survive our worst days, and that sometimes a stranger's kindness is what makes survival possible. Cameron Price was 35 years old and a software engineer at a tech company where he wrote code that solved problems and debugged systems and created elegant solutions to complex challenges, work that felt satisfying because it had clear answers and predictable outcomes, unlike parenting, which was chaos wrapped in love, wrapped in constant terror that he was doing everything wrong. He was a single father to 7-year-old Zara, who had her mother's smile and her father's stubborn determination and a laugh that could light up rooms, but who was currently lying in a hospital bed recovering from surgery that had terrified both of them. His wife India had died 2 years ago from breast cancer that had been diagnosed too late and spread too fast and stolen her from them before Zara was old enough to form permanent memories of the woman who'd loved her more than breathing. He'd been raising Zara alone for 2 years, figuring out how to be both mother and father, how to braid hair through YouTube tutorials and navigate girl drama at school and explain why mama wasn't coming back from heaven no matter how many times Zara asked. He was at the hospital because Zara had woken at 5 a.m. screaming that her stomach hurt in ways that weren't normal tummy ache, had been rushed to emergency room where doctors had diagnosed appendicitis and rushed her into surgery before Cameron had fully processed what was happening. Had spent 6 hours in surgical waiting room feeling every second like an eternity while his daughter was cut open and he couldn't protect her from the pain or the fear or the trauma of waking up in a hospital, surrounded by strangers. He was overwhelmed in ways that made it hard to breathe, exhausted from 2 years of solo parenting plus 1 night of no sleep plus 6 hours of surgical waiting room terror, grieving not just India anymore but also the illusion that he could protect his daughter from everything, that being a good father meant preventing all pain when actually being a good father meant being present during pain he couldn't prevent. He'd stepped out of Zara's room for tea to compose himself because she'd woken crying and asking for mama, and he'd had to explain again that mama was in heaven and couldn't come but daddy was here and would always be here, and watching her face crumple with disappointment that daddy wasn't. Mama had broken something in him that needed 15 minutes and lukewarm tea to repair before he could go back and be strong again. He was still wearing grief like a second skin, had learned to function while carrying the weight of loss but hadn't learned to stop carrying it, moved through the world with India's absence as his constant companion, made decisions filtered through the question of what she would have wanted him to do, parented with the awareness that he was solo performer in a role designed for 2 people and was probably failing in ways he couldn't see but would discover later when Zara was in therapy. Discussing her childhood. The 3 girls who approached his table were Maya and Sophie and Emma, identical triplets who were 6 years old with matching brown braids tied with colorful beads and identical faces that showed signs of having cried recently, mixed-race children with their mother's dark brown skin and features that suggested their absent father had been white. Their father had left when they were babies, had disappeared from their lives so completely that they'd never known what it felt like to have a dad, had grown up in a household of 4 females figuring out life without male presence or financial support or any acknowledgement from the man who contributed DNA but nothing else to their existence. Their mother Rachel was a single mom doing the impossible work of raising triplets alone, was stretched so thin between parenting and working and surviving that emergency surgery had become a crisis not just medically but logistically because there was no one to watch her daughters, no family nearby to call, no support system beyond a neighbor who'd promised to come but had called last minute with her own emergency. Rachel was having emergency gallbladder surgery right now, was being cut open on the 4th floor while her daughters sat in the waiting room alone because the hospital wouldn't let 6-year-olds wait unsupervised but also wouldn't stop emergency surgery just because a single mother had no one to call. The girls were alone in the waiting room, terrified their mom wouldn't wake up, had absorbed enough from adult conversations and television and the general atmosphere of hospitals to understand that sometimes people went into surgery and didn't come back, were carrying the particular fear of children who'd already lost one parent to abandonment and couldn't survive losing the other to death. They needed adult presence and comfort, needed someone who would sit with them and hold their hands and promise them that mama would be okay even though no one could actually promise that, needed what children always need in hospitals, which is someone who makes them feel less alone in their terror. Cameron had been avoiding Zara's room because he needed a moment to compose himself after she'd asked for mama, needed to rebuild his strength before going back to be the strong daddy who had all the answers and never showed fear even when fear was eating him alive from the inside. He was drinking tea that had gone cold because he'd been sitting here for 20 minutes staring at nothing while trying to convince himself that he could do this, could continue being both parents, could survive the constant terror that something would happen to Zara and he'd fail to protect her the way he'd failed to protect India from cancer that couldn't be fought with love alone. 3 girls approached his table with careful steps like they were approaching a wild animal that might bolt, stood in formation like they'd planned this approach and knew exactly what they were going to say, looked at him with eyes that had already seen too much disappointment to expect adults to help without being convinced. They asked him to pretend to be their father with voices that trembled despite their attempt at confidence, explained that their mom was in surgery and they were alone and scared, and the nurse said they needed a parent present in the waiting room but they didn't have a parent available, so could he maybe just pretend for a few hours until mama woke up. Cameron's first instinct was to decline because he had his own crisis happening upstairs, had his own daughter who needed him, had his own terror and exhaustion and grief to manage without taking on someone else's emergency. But he saw their fear, saw the way their hands were linked together like that connection was the only thing keeping them from falling apart, saw the desperate hope in their eyes that maybe this stranger would say yes when saying no would have been easier and more reasonable. He remembered Zara's fear this morning, remembered holding her hand during the ambulance ride and wishing someone could hold his hand because being the strong parent was exhausting when you were terrified too. And he said yes to 3 strangers who needed a father figure for a few hours, said yes because walking away from scared children felt impossible when his own scared child was safe upstairs, said yes because maybe helping someone else's daughters would somehow make up for all the times he'd failed his own daughter by being one person trying to do a 2-person job. Said yes because India would have wanted him to help and because grief had taught him that sometimes the only way through darkness was to become someone else's light even when your own light was flickering. Have you ever been so broken by your own crisis that helping someone else became the thing that saved you? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. At 2:20 p.m., 5 minutes after Cameron had said yes to 3 strangers who needed help when saying no would have been reasonable and understandable and completely justified, he was still processing what had just happened, was still trying to reconcile his instinct to decline with the reality that he'd agreed to pretend to be the father of children he'd never met while his own daughter was recovering from surgery 1 floor above. 3 identical girls stood at his table with faces that were mirror images of each other, identical triplets who were maybe 6 years old with matching brown braids adorned with colorful beads, mixed-race children with beautiful deep brown skin and features that showed their father had been white though clearly not present, clearly scared in ways that made their small bodies tremble despite their attempts to appear brave. "Pretend you're our father," they'd said, the request so absurd that Cameron's first response had been confusion, had been the automatic assumption that he'd misheard or misunderstood because children didn't just approach strangers in hospital cafeterias asking them to play pretend family during medical emergencies. Cameron was confused in ways that made him wonder if exhaustion and stress had finally broken his ability to process normal reality, if 24 hours without sleep and 6 hours of surgical waiting room terror had damaged his comprehension, if these children were actually asking what he thought they were asking, or if this was some kind of misunderstanding that would be cleared up with clarification. The girls explained with the kind of careful detail that suggested they'd rehearsed this conversation, had anticipated his confusion and prepared answers to questions he hadn't asked yet. Their mom was in surgery right now, emergency gallbladder surgery on the 4th floor, had been rushed into operating room 2 hours ago after collapsing at school where she taught 4th grade. They were alone in the surgery waiting room, had been sitting there for 2 hours with no adult supervision because their neighbor who'd promised to come had called with her own emergency and couldn't make it. No family lived nearby, their grandmother was in another state and couldn't get here for hours, their mother's sister was overseas, their mother's friends all had their own jobs and children and lives that made dropping everything for someone else's emergency impossible. They were scared she wouldn't wake up, had absorbed enough from adult conversations and television medical dramas to understand that surgery sometimes went wrong, that sometimes people were put to sleep and never woke up, that their mother who was their entire world could potentially die on an operating table while they sat in a waiting room with no one to hold them or tell them everything would be okay. They needed an adult there not just for comfort but for logistics. The hospital wouldn't let them wait alone in the surgery waiting room, kept sending nurses over to ask where their parent was, kept threatening to call social services if a responsible adult didn't show up soon. They needed a parent present, even if that parent was borrowed, even if that parent was a stranger who was only pretending, because the hospital required adult supervision and they had no adults available except this tired-looking man drinking cold tea who seemed kind enough to maybe help. Cameron's mind processed the situation with the systematic assessment he usually reserved for debugging code at work, cataloging facts that needed to be evaluated before making decisions that could have consequences he couldn't predict. They were 6 years old, 3 identical children who should have been in school or playing or doing anything other than sitting alone in a hospital waiting room while their mother underwent surgery. They were clearly terrified despite their attempts to appear composed, their voices shaking and their hands linked together and their eyes showing the particular fear of children who understood that adults couldn't fix everything no matter how much power children believed parents possessed. Their mother was in surgery right now, was being cut open and stitched back together while her daughters had no one to sit with them, no family member or friend or neighbor who could provide the basic comfort that children needed during crisis. They were alone in ways that made Cameron's chest ache, alone in ways that reminded him of worst-case scenarios he'd imagined about Zara, alone in ways that no 6-year-old should ever be. He had his own daughter upstairs recovering from her own surgery, had Zara who needed him and who he promised would never be alone the way he'd been alone after India died, had his own crisis that should take priority over strangers' emergencies. He should say no, should explain that he had his own child to care for, should offer sympathy but decline involvement because his plate was already too full and his emotional reserves were already depleted and taking on someone else's crisis felt impossible when he was barely managing his own. But they were children, 3 little girls who were scared and alone and had approached him specifically because something about him had suggested he might help when other adults would have said no. They were children who needed help in ways that were immediate and urgent and couldn't wait for someone more appropriate to appear. Zara was stable upstairs, was sleeping peacefully when he'd checked on her 10 minutes ago, had pain medication keeping her comfortable and nurses checking on her every 30 minutes, had everything she needed except his presence for the next hour or two. He had time before she'd wake and need him, had time to help children who had no one else, had time to be the adult these girls desperately needed while their mother fought for her life in an operating room. What if this was Zara alone in a waiting room with no one to hold her hand? What if something happened to him and Zara needed a stranger to step up and be kind when kindness wasn't required or expected or convenient? What if the universe kept score and helping these girls somehow meant the universe would send someone to help Zara if she ever needed it? He couldn't say no to 3 terrified children asking for help, couldn't walk away from a situation where saying yes cost him nothing but time and saying no would cost them the comfort they desperately needed, couldn't be the kind of man who prioritized his own convenience over children's fear when he had the capacity to help even if helping wasn't his responsibility. At 2:25 p.m., 10 minutes after the initial request, Cameron was learning their names and making the commitment official. "I'm Maya," the girl on the left said, the one who seemed to be the designated spokesperson, the one whose voice was steadiest even though her hands were shaking. "I'm Sophie," the middle girl added, slightly quieter, slightly more reserved, the one who seemed to process everything internally before speaking. "I'm Emma," the girl on the right finished, the one with tears already forming in her eyes, the one whose emotion was closest to the surface. "I'm Cameron," he replied, offering his hand to shake with each of them in turn, treating them with the formality he'd use with adults because children deserved to be taken seriously especially when they were scared. "What's your mom's name?" he asked, figuring if he was going to pretend to be their father he should at least know the name of the woman he was allegedly married to. "Rachel," Maya answered. "Rachel Martinez. She teaches 4th grade at Lincoln Elementary and she makes really good pancakes and she reads to us every night even when she's tired and she's the best mom in the whole world." "Okay," Cameron said, standing from his table and gathering his phone and wallet, "I'll stay with you until your mom's surgery is done," the commitment simple but weighted with significance he didn't fully understand yet, the decision to help strangers in ways that would change all of their lives, though he couldn't know that at 2:25 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. The girls' relief was visible, their shoulders dropping and their hands unclasping slightly, and something like hope flickering across their identical faces, hope that maybe this stranger would actually help instead of disappointing them the way adults so often disappointed children by prioritizing their own comfort over children's needs. They led him to the surgery waiting room on the 4th floor, 3 small girls walking in formation with Cameron following like a mismatched parade, led him through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and anxiety and the particular atmosphere of hospitals where everyone was dealing with their own crisis. The waiting room was full of anxious families, people sitting in uncomfortable chairs staring at phones or magazines without actually seeing them, people waiting for news about loved ones who were being cut open or scanned or treated, people existing in the liminal space between before and after where time moved strangely and every minute felt like an hour. The girls sat close to Cameron on a row of connected chairs, positioned themselves with military precision, one girl on each side and one in the middle, created a formation that suggested they'd learned to stick together because separation meant vulnerability. Cameron texted his boss that he'd be offline for a few more hours, texted the nurse's station to check on Zara who was still sleeping peacefully, texted his mother who'd wanted to come to the hospital but whom he'd told to stay home because he could handle this alone the way he handled everything alone since India died. At 2:30 p.m., 15 minutes into their unexpected arrangement, the girls began to open up in ways that suggested they'd been holding stories inside that needed to be released. They told him about their mom, about Rachel who was a 4th grade teacher at Lincoln Elementary, who worked impossibly hard to support 3 children on a teacher's salary that was never quite enough, who took on tutoring gigs and summer school positions and every extra hour she could find to keep them fed and clothed and in their small apartment. "She works really hard," Sophie said, "so hard that sometimes she falls asleep while reading to us at bedtime, just falls asleep mid-sentence because she's been working since 5 a.m. and it's now 9 p.m. and she has nothing left. We help her," Emma added, "we do our own laundry even though we're only 6 and we make our own breakfast most mornings and we're really good at being quiet when she has headaches from stress." "There's no daddy," Maya stated matter-of-factly, "he left when we were babies, before we could even remember him, so it's just the 4 of us and Mama says that's enough, says we're a complete family even without him, but sometimes she cries when she thinks we're asleep and we know she's lonely even though she pretends she's not." Cameron felt his throat tighten at their casual recitation of hardship, at how they described single parenthood and poverty and abandonment with the acceptance of children who'd never known anything different. He shared his own story with the honesty he'd learned grief demanded, told them he had a daughter upstairs named Zara who was 7 years old and had just had her appendix removed, told them she was okay now but that he'd been terrified watching her in pain, told them that being a parent meant being scared most of the time but learning to be brave anyway because children needed adults who could hold fear and function simultaneously. The conversation deepened in ways Cameron hadn't expected, moved beyond polite small talk into territory that felt raw and real. Maya asked about his wife with the directness that children wielded without social filters, asked where Zara's mommy was, asked if they were divorced like some of the kids' parents at school. "She died 2 years ago," Cameron answered honestly, "cancer that came too fast and took her too soon, and now it's just me and Zara figuring out how to be a family of 2 instead of 3. The girls absorbed this information with the gravity of children who understood loss even if their loss was different, who'd never known their father but understood absence, who'd grown up with a parent-shaped hole that had never been filled. Cameron had never thought about that perspective before, had never considered that abandonment and death were different types of loss but both left children without fathers, both created absence that shaped childhood in ways that couldn't be undone. Different losses but the same pain of growing up with one parent when the world was designed for 2, the same exhaustion of watching that one parent carry burdens meant to be shared, the same fear that something might happen to the only parent left and then there would be no one. The girls asked questions that broke Cameron's heart in ways he hadn't expected, asked what it was like having a dad in tones that suggested they'd wondered this many times but had never had anyone to ask. Cameron's heart cracked as he tried to explain what fathers did, how they protected and loved and showed up, how they carried children on their shoulders and fixed broken toys and read bedtime stories and made children feel safe in a world that was often scary. Like what I'm doing now, Cameron found himself saying, like sitting with you when you're scared, like being present when you need someone, like choosing to help even when helping isn't my responsibility. That's what dads do. The girls absorbed this information like they were filing it away for future reference, like they were learning what they'd missed, like maybe having a borrowed dad for a few hours could teach them something about the real thing they'd never had. They talked about school and friends and the fact that being triplets meant people always mixed them up even though they had completely different personalities if adults would just pay attention. They talked about their apartment and their cat and the fact that Mama always made sure they had birthday parties even though money was tight. They talked about how much they loved their mom and how scared they were that something would happen to her and they'd be alone in ways they couldn't survive. At 3 p.m., exactly 45 minutes after Cameron had agreed to help, a surgeon appeared in the waiting room doorway wearing scrubs that were stained with evidence of the work she'd been doing, pulled down her surgical mask and called out "Family of Rachel Martinez." Cameron stood automatically, the girls flanking him like an honor guard, walked toward the surgeon with 3 children gripping his hands and arms like he was the only stable thing in a world that had become terrifying. "I'm their father," Cameron heard himself say, the lie smooth because it felt true in the moment, felt true because he'd been sitting with them and holding their fear and showing up in ways their actual father never had. The surgeon smiled, seemed to accept this without question, launched into medical explanation about how the surgery had gone well, how Rachel's gallbladder had been successfully removed, how she'd be in recovery soon and would be moved to a room where the girls could see her. The girls started crying, 3 identical faces dissolving into tears of relief that their mother was alive, that the surgery was over, that they hadn't lost the only parent they had. They turned to Cameron simultaneously and hugged him with the fierce gratitude of children who'd been holding terror for hours and could finally release it, hugged him like he was actually their father, like he'd actually been there for them their whole lives instead of just 45 minutes, hugged him with a trust he hadn't earned but had somehow received anyway just by choosing to stay when everyone else had walked away. At 3:30 p.m., 1 hour after Cameron had become a temporary father to 3 strangers and 30 minutes after learning their actual mother would survive surgery, the girls were allowed into the recovery room to see Rachel, were escorted by a nurse who told Cameron he should wait outside because only immediate family was permitted during recovery. Cameron nodded and prepared to return to his own daughter, prepared to slip back into his real life where he was father to 1 child not 4, prepared to let these girls return to their mother and forget about the stranger who'd sat with them when they'd needed someone. Then the nurse reappeared in the doorway, looked directly at Cameron with confusion that suggested she'd just received information that didn't match her expectations. "She's asking for you," the nurse said, gesturing for Cameron to follow her into the recovery area where Rachel was apparently awake and requesting to speak with the man her daughters kept calling Daddy Cameron. Cameron was confused because why would a woman he'd never met be asking for him? Why would someone who'd just undergone surgery want to meet the stranger her children had recruited to pretend to be their father? Why would she not just send the nurse out to thank him and let him leave without the awkwardness of actually meeting face to face? The girl's father, the nurse clarified, though there was something in her tone that suggested she'd heard the story and knew something was unusual about this family configuration but was too professional to ask questions that weren't her business. "I should explain," Cameron started, "should probably clarify before going in there that he wasn't actually their father, that this whole situation was elaborate pretend orchestrated by desperate children, that Rachel might not want a stranger in her recovery room no matter how helpful he'd been to her daughters." But the nurse was already leading him through the recovery area, past curtained beds where other patients were waking from their own surgeries, past machines that beeped and monitors that tracked vital signs, to the corner bed where Rachel Martinez lay with tubes in her arms and monitors attached to her chest and 3 daughters crowded as close to her bed as the nurses would allow. Rachel was groggy from anesthesia, her words slightly slurred and her eyes struggling to focus, looking at Cameron with confusion that suggested the pain medication was making it hard for her to process what her daughters were telling her about the stranger who'd stayed with them. "Who are you?" Rachel asked, the question direct despite the anesthesia fog, asked with the wariness of a single mother who'd learned that strangers couldn't always be trusted especially around her children. The girls explained everything in their typical overlapping chaos, Maya talking about how they'd found him in the cafeteria, Sophie adding that he'd said yes when they'd asked him to pretend, Emma finishing with the detail that he'd stayed the whole time and held their hands when they were scared and had even cried a little when the surgeon said Mama would be okay. Rachel's reaction shifted from confusion to shock to embarrassment in the space of seconds, her face showing the particular mortification of a parent whose children had done something well-meaning but completely inappropriate. "I'm so sorry," Rachel said, trying to sit up straighter despite the pain and the medications making movement difficult. "They shouldn't have bothered you, they know better than to talk to strangers. I can't believe they asked you to pretend to be their father, that's so inappropriate and I'm so sorry you felt obligated to help." "They didn't bother me," Cameron interrupted before Rachel could continue apologizing for her daughter's choice to ask for help when help was desperately needed, interrupted because those words felt important, felt like something Rachel needed to hear. "They needed help and I was available to give it, needed someone to sit with them while you were in surgery and I happened to be in the cafeteria drinking tea when they approached, needed a father figure for a few hours because their actual father isn't present and hospitals require adult supervision and you had no one else they could call." Cameron explained his own situation with the economy of someone used to telling this story, told Rachel he had a daughter upstairs recovering from appendectomy, told her he understood what it meant to be alone in a hospital during a medical crisis, told her he understood scared children because he'd watched his own daughter be scared just that morning. "I couldn't leave them," Cameron said simply, "couldn't walk away from 3 terrified little girls who needed someone to tell them their mother would be okay even if I had no way of knowing that was true, couldn't be the kind of man who prioritizes his own comfort over children's fear when I had the capacity to help." Rachel was emotional in ways that anesthesia was making harder to control, tears leaking from her eyes even as she tried to maintain composure, tried to hold it together the way single mothers learn to hold it together because falling apart wasn't an option when children were watching. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for what Cameron had done but the only words available. "Thank you for staying with my daughters when you had your own daughter to worry about, thank you for being kind to strangers, thank you for being the kind of man who says yes when children ask for help." Connection was forming between two people who'd never met but who recognized something in each other, recognized the exhaustion of single parenthood and the fear of medical emergencies and the particular loneliness of navigating crisis alone. Rachel asked about his daughter with the genuine concern of one parent for another's child, asked how Zara was doing and whether the surgery had gone well and whether Cameron was managing okay with the stress of emergency pediatric surgery. Cameron explained Zara's appendectomy with the same detail Rachel would have wanted if their situations were reversed, told her Zara was stable and sleeping and recovering well, told her the surgery had been successful and terrifying in equal measure. "You should be with her," Rachel said, the statement carrying guilt that Cameron had spent his afternoon with her daughters instead of his own child, carrying the automatic assumption that his own daughter's needs should supersede helping strangers. "She's sleeping," Cameron replied, "checked on her 20 minutes ago and she's comfortable and the nurses are monitoring her and she won't miss me for another hour. I'll check on her soon but your girls needed someone more immediately than Zara needed me to be sitting beside her bed watching her sleep." Rachel's gratitude was visible in ways that went beyond words, was written across her face in the relief of a parent who'd been terrified that her daughters had been alone during the worst hours of her life. "I don't know how to thank you," Rachel said, voice still rough from anesthesia and emotion, "don't know what you say to someone who stayed with strangers' children during a medical emergency when you had your own crisis to manage, don't know how to express what it means that my daughters weren't alone while I was unconscious being cut open." "They're not strangers anymore," Cameron said, the statement simple but true because an hour of sitting with scared children during crisis had created connection that couldn't be undone, had transformed 3 unknown girls into people he cared about even though he'd known them less time than he'd known most of his co-workers. The girls agreed enthusiastically, Maya declaring that he was Daddy Cameron now, Sophie adding that he'd promised to check on them before he left the hospital, Emma insisting that he had to come visit when Mama came home because they wanted to introduce him to their cat. Both adults laughed at the girls' immediate adoption of this stranger into their family structure, laughed with the slightly hysterical edge of people who'd survived medical emergencies and were still processing the adrenaline crash. The moment held warmth that surprised both Cameron and Rachel, held the possibility of connection beyond this hospital room, held something that felt like the beginning of friendship forged in the particular intensity of crisis. Cameron pulled out his phone and opened a new contact, handed it to Rachel, who was still attached to monitors and IVs but was coherent enough to enter her number with fingers that shook slightly. "If you need anything," Cameron said, the offer genuine because he understood how hard recovery would be for a single mother with no support system, understood that she'd be sent home in a day or two and expected to care for 3 children while recovering from surgery, understood that having one person to call for help could be the difference between surviving and drowning. "Recovery is hard alone," Cameron continued, voice carrying the weight of experience because he'd recovered from his own grief alone, had navigated single parenthood alone, had learned that asking for help felt impossible but that having help offered made asking easier. "I know what it's like to need help and not have anyone to call, know what it's like to try to do everything yourself because you think that's what strength means, know what it's like to finally accept that sometimes strength means letting people help you." Rachel was grateful in ways that made her voice crack, was taking his number with hands that trembled from exhaustion and anesthesia and the overwhelming relief of not having to do this completely alone. She saved his contact under a name he could see on her screen, Cameron, the stranger who stayed, and something about that description made his throat tight because being the person who stayed was exactly who he wanted to be, for Zara and apparently now for 3 little girls and their mother who'd needed someone to not walk away when walking away would have been easier. 1 week after Rachel's surgery, after 7 days of Cameron checking in via text to make sure she and the girls were managing recovery without complications, after 7 days of brief conversations that felt too short and left him wanting to know more about this woman and her daughters who'd somehow become important to him in the space of a few hours, Rachel called asking for help with a voice that carried the exhaustion of someone trying to do too much too soon. She was still recovering from surgery but the girls needed to be picked up from school and taken to their evening activities and she couldn't drive yet because of the pain medications, couldn't lift anything heavier than a coffee cup because of surgical restrictions, couldn't manage 3 active 6-year-olds while her body was still healing from being cut open. "Can you help?" Rachel asked, the question tentative because asking for help felt vulnerable especially from someone she'd only met once under the worst circumstances. Asking felt like admitting she couldn't do everything alone, which was admission single parents learned to avoid because alone was their default setting. Cameron said yes immediately, said yes before she'd finished explaining what she needed, said yes because helping felt natural now that he'd already helped once, said yes and offered to bring Zara along so the girls could meet each other and maybe the 4 of them could play while the adults figured out logistics. The girls met for the first time in Rachel's small living room that was cluttered with the evidence of 3 children and limited space, met with the careful assessment children use when evaluating potential friends, met and within 5 minutes were playing together like they'd known each other their whole lives. Instant connection formed between Zara and the triplets, for girls who understood what it meant to have a single parent and hospital stays and fear that colored ordinary moments, for girls who played with the intensity of children who'd learned early that family wasn't just biology but whoever showed up consistently. Cameron and Rachel talked while the girls played, sat at her kitchen table drinking coffee that Rachel had made despite his protests that she should be resting, talked about single parenthood and the particular challenges of raising children alone and the constant calculation of whether they were doing enough or failing in ways they couldn't see. Both single parents navigating the same exhaustion, both understanding the struggle of being one person trying to fill 2 roles, both recognizing in each other the particular loneliness of having no one to share the burden of making every decision about another human's future. 2 weeks later Cameron was helping regularly in ways that surprised him because he'd thought that first afternoon at the hospital would be a one-time thing, was picking up all 4 girls from school because Rachel's recovery was slower than expected and driving was still painful, was stopping by her apartment after work to make sure she had everything she needed because asking for help didn't come naturally to someone who'd been doing everything alone for 6 years. Rachel reciprocated when she recovered enough to function normally, started taking Zara when Cameron had late meetings or deadlines that required staying at the office past normal pickup time, started being the backup parent that every single parent desperately needed but rarely had. A support system was forming between 2 families who'd been isolated in their respective struggles, forming in ways that felt organic rather than forced, forming because both Cameron and Rachel understood that surviving single parenthood required help and that pride was less important than making sure children were cared for consistently. They became each other's emergency contact, became the person the other could call when life became overwhelming, became friends in the way that people become friends when they've seen each other's worst and chosen to stay anyway. 1 month after that hospital afternoon, Cameron realized he liked Rachel in ways that went beyond friendship and gratitude and the practical benefits of co-parenting support, liked her not just as a fellow single parent who understood his life but as a woman who was smart and funny and beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with their circumstances. He liked how she laughed at his terrible jokes, liked how she was patient with all 4 girls even when they were being impossible, liked how she built a life for her daughters with nothing but determination and love, liked how she made him feel less alone in ways he hadn't felt since India died. Rachel felt the same growing attraction but was scared to acknowledge it because attraction meant vulnerability and vulnerability meant risk and risk meant the possibility of being hurt again, scared because her daughter's father had abandoned them and she'd spent 6 years building walls that kept everyone at safe distance, scared because Cameron was grieving a wife he'd loved deeply and maybe he was just looking for friendship not romance. Both scared in different ways, both been hurt by loss whether through death or abandonment, both carrying damage that made new relationships feel impossible even when new relationships might be exactly what they needed. 3 months after the hospital, after 3 months of daily texts and weekend playdates and slowly realizing that friendship had evolved into something deeper, Cameron asked Rachel out on a proper date with nervousness that reminded him of being 16 and asking a girl to prom. Not a casual coffee while the girls played, not a quick dinner between kid activities, but an actual date where they dressed up and went to a restaurant that didn't have a children's menu and talked without being interrupted by demands for snacks or arbitration of playground disputes. The girls babysat each other with the help of an actual professional sitter because leaving 4 girls alone would have been irresponsible, but the symbolism of the 4 of them together felt important, felt like acknowledgement that they were becoming a unit, felt like the first step toward being an actual blended family. Cameron and Rachel had dinner at a restaurant with cloth napkins and wine lists, talked without the buffer of children and discovered that attraction was even stronger without the distraction of parental responsibilities, talked about their late spouse and ex-partner and the different ways they'd learned to survive loss, talked until the restaurant closed and they were the last customers and the staff was politely hinting that it was time to leave. The connection was undeniable in ways that made both of them stop pretending they were just friends, was the kind of chemistry that couldn't be ignored or rationalized away, was the beginning of something that terrified both of them but that also felt inevitable, like they'd been moving toward this moment since 3 little girls had approached a stranger in a cafeteria and asked him to pretend. 6 months after the hospital, Cameron and Rachel were officially together in ways that made the girls absolutely insufferable with their pride at having orchestrated this relationship, were dating with the careful navigation required when children were involved, were building something that felt real and lasting. The 4 girls were inseparable, had become bonus sisters who fought like biological siblings and loved each other with the fierce devotion of children who'd chosen to be family, had sleepovers every weekend that alternated between Cameron's house and Rachel's apartment, had created their own language and inside jokes and elaborate games that only made sense to them. "Your girls saved me," Rachel told Cameron one evening after all 4 children were finally asleep, "saved me from doing this alone forever, from believing I had to carry everything myself, from thinking that single parenthood meant being isolated." Cameron replied that his girl had saved him too, that Zara had given him purpose after India died, that being her father had kept him alive when grief tried to drown him, that watching her become sisters with Maya and Sophie and Emma had taught him that family could expand in unexpected ways. 1 year after that Tuesday afternoon in the hospital cafeteria, Cameron took Rachel and all 4 girls back to the same hospital, walked them through the corridors to the cafeteria, found table 12 where he'd been sitting alone drinking lukewarm tea before 3 strangers had changed his life. The girls knew something was happening because Cameron had that particular nervousness that adults got before important moments, were vibrating with excitement because they'd been in on the planning and had helped choose the ring and had practiced their lines. Cameron knelt beside the table where everything had started, pulled out a ring box with hands that shook slightly, looked at Rachel who was already crying because she understood what was about to happen. But before he could say anything, before he could deliver the speech he'd prepared about love and second chances and building families from broken pieces, Maya and Sophie and Emma knelt beside him with rehearsed synchronization and asked in unison, "Will you marry our daddy Cameron, and will he be our real daddy forever, not just pretend?" Rachel was crying too hard to speak, could only nod yes through tears that meant relief and joy and the overwhelming gratitude of someone who'd been alone for so long and was finally being chosen, was saying yes to Cameron and yes to being part of this family that had formed from crisis and kindness and 3 brave little girls who'd asked a stranger for help. The wedding was small ceremony 6 months later in the same hospital chapel where Rachel had recovered and where Cameron had visited Zara. Small ceremony that felt appropriate because hospitals were where their story had started, where the worst days had become the best things. 4 flower girls walked down the aisle in matching dresses that they'd chosen after extensive debate, Zara and Maya and Sophie and Emma, all sisters now in ways that mattered more than biology, all beaming with pride at having orchestrated this union. Started with tea and 3 brave girls, Cameron said during his vows, started with the worst day becoming the best day because your daughters saw a lonely man and decided he could help their lonely mother, started with pretending and became the most real thing in my life. Best request they ever made, Rachel replied during her vows, best decision I ever made was leaving them in that waiting room where they could find you, best thing that ever happened to us was 3 little girls being brave enough to ask a stranger for help. 2 years after the wedding their blended family was thriving in ways that had seemed impossible during those dark days in the hospital, was living proof that healing happened when broken people chose to help each other heal. Cameron had legally adopted the triplets who now carried his last name hyphenated with Rachel's, who called him Daddy without the Cameron qualifier, who'd stopped asking what it was like to have a father because they knew what it was like now. Rachel was pregnant with their son, was carrying the baby that would make their family of 6 into a family of 7, was glowing with the particular joy of someone who thought her family was complete but was discovering it could expand even more. The 4 girls were excited about becoming big sisters, were already planning how they'd teach the baby everything they knew, were arguing about whose room the baby would sleep in first, were demonstrating the chaos and love that defined their family. The family was complete in ways that transcended the traditional definitions, was complete because it had been built from crisis and choice and the decision to show up consistently for people who needed showing up for. At the hospital for their son's birth, walking through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and new beginnings, they passed the cafeteria where everything had started, past table 12 where Cameron had been sitting alone drinking tea before 3 little girls had approached with a desperate request. That's where we found Daddy, Maya announced, pointing at the table like it was a historical landmark, where we asked him to pretend and he said yes even though we were strangers. Where you saved us all, Cameron corrected, pulling all 4 girls close, where you were brave enough to ask for help when asking felt impossible, where you taught me that helping others was how I healed myself. Where our family started, Rachel added, one hand on her pregnant belly and the other hand holding Cameron's, where the worst day became the best day, where 3 little girls and a stranger drinking tea became 6 people who loved each other. Their son was born 3 hours later, was welcomed into the world by 2 parents and 4 sisters, and a story about how families could be built from the rubble of loss, was the embodiment of hope and healing and new beginnings, was proof that the worst days really could become the beginning of the best things if you were brave enough to say yes when strangers asked for help. When Cameron Price sat alone drinking lukewarm tea in a hospital cafeteria at 2:15 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, trying to compose himself after watching his 7-year-old daughter Zara scream in pain during emergency appendectomy, feeling the weight of single fatherhood pressing on his chest like a physical thing that made breathing difficult, feeling 2 years of grief since his wife India had died threatening to drown him, feeling inadequate and exhausted and certain he was failing at being both mother and father to a child who deserved 2 parents, 3 identical little girls with matching braids and desperate eyes approached his table and whispered with the kind of urgency that bypassed all social conventions that they needed him to pretend to be their father just for today while their mama Rachel was in surgery, just until the surgery was done, just so she wouldn't have to be scared alone. He thought he should decline because his hands were already full with his own crisis, because he could barely manage being father to 1 child much less pretend to be father to 3 more, because taking on someone else's emergency when he was drowning in his own felt impossible. But these girls, Maya and Sophie and Emma, were 6 years old and terrified in ways that reminded him of Zara's fear that morning, were alone in a hospital because their father had abandoned them when they were babies and their mother was being cut open down the hall. Were desperate for an adult presence that would make them feel less vulnerable in a building full of sick people and bad news and the particular fear that came from watching the only parent you had disappear into surgery. And Cameron, who'd promised his late wife India that he'd protect their daughter Zara always, who'd sworn over her hospital bed as she died from cancer that he would be both parents and never let Zara feel alone, who understood what it meant to be a scared child in a hospital because he'd just watched his own daughter be scared that morning, who knew that being a father to one child meant being kind to all children because fatherhood was about showing up when showing up was hard, said yes to a request that would teach him that sometimes healing your own broken heart means helping heal someone else's, that the worst days can become the beginning of the best things if you're brave enough to help when helping feels impossible, that 3 little girls asking a stranger to pretend can lead to a family that's more real than anything biology could create. Because sometimes we're so broken by our own pain that we forget we can still help others carry theirs. Sometimes the person you help during your worst day becomes the person who helps you survive all the days after. Sometimes 3 children asking for a few hours of pretending leads to years of being the kind of family that's chosen rather than assigned. Sometimes the kindness you show when you think you have nothing left to give becomes the thing that saves you as much as it saves the people you helped. And if this story reminded you that showing up for strangers in their darkest moments creates light in your own darkness, that helping others heal is how we heal ourselves, that the worst days can transform into the best beginnings if we're brave enough to say yes when children ask for help, then you understand why stories like this need to reach people who are sitting alone right now believing they're too broken to help anyone, who think their crisis disqualifies them from kindness, who need to know that sometimes being saved means becoming someone else's savior first. Have you ever helped a stranger during your own crisis and discovered that helping them helped you more than you helped them? Ever said yes when saying no would have been easier? Ever had your worst day become the beginning of your best life because you chose kindness over convenience? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10, because your engagement helps us know that messages about ordinary people doing extraordinary things through simple acts of showing up matter enough to share with others who desperately need to hear them.